All right, everyone, just a quick question. Have you ever been in a store where you couldn't find what you needed or waited forever in a confusing line? Well, the frustration you felt? That's bad layout design that is costing businesses millions. So today we are diving into how smart companies like McDonald's completely revolutionize their operations and their profits. So just by rearranging where things go. So today we will be learning several layout strategies that will make the operations effective and efficient. So let's go. So let us zoom out for a second and see where we fit in the big picture. So layout strategies sits right here in part 2, the designing operations. Now think of it this way. First, we decide what we're going to make and how we're going to make it. Then we figure out where to put everything. So it is like planning your dream kitchen. The layout can make or break how efficiently you can cook. So same principle, just on a massive business scale. So by the end of today's class, you will master three key things. The first one, what layout actually means in business terms. It is way more strategic than just where stuff goes. The second, we will explore the different types of layouts from your local Jollibee to SM's massive malls to Mercury Drugs efficient store operations. And third, we will dive into the math behind it. So specifically, how to design process layouts and balance assembly lines. So think of this as your toolkit for solving real-world space and efficiency puzzles that every manager faces. So what is layout? Well, layout is not just about making things look pretty. It's pure strategy. Think about when you walk into a Jollibee versus a traditional Filipino carinderia. So same goal, feed people, but completely different layouts, right? So Jollibee's counter system gets you in and out fast, while the carinderia lets you see all the dishes spread out to tempt you. So that is layout in action. Every choice about where to put equipment, people, and workstations directly impacts productivity, costs, and whether the business hits its targets. Okay, so let us start with office layouts. So the key here is grouping workers, equipment, and spaces to maximize comfort, safety, and most importantly, information flow. Now, I'd like you to notice how this modern office in your screen arranges desks, cubicles, and meeting spaces. So it is all strategic. The main goal here is making conversations and collaboration easier. So think of it like setting up your own living room, okay? So people naturally talk to each other. So when information flows smoothly between team members, well, productivity skyrockets and work gets done faster. Now notice this retail layouts. This is where psychology meets business. So the core principle is very simple. Sales and profitability vary directly with customer exposure to products, okay? So retailers strategically arrange items to catch your eye and encourage you to buy more. So a very perfect example right now as you see on your screen is, why do you think SM Supermarket puts the milk and the bread at the back of the store? Why do you think? It's because they force you to walk past hundreds of other products first. So every aisle, every shelf placement, every end cup design is calculated to maximize your spending. So as you have noticed, at the end of your grocery, oh my god, I don't need this, but why did I buy this? Okay? So that is the strategy of every grocery or department stores. So now let us go to warehouse layouts. So warehouse layouts is all about finding this optimal spot wherein there is an optimum trade-off between handling costs and storage space costs. So see these towering rack systems in the photos, okay? The towering rack systems. So modern warehouses use automated cranes and retrieval systems to maximize vertical space. So we are talking 30 to 40 feet high. So these involves balancing incoming transport, your storage, and outgoing transport. So it is like organizing a super tall garage where robotic systems grab your tools from any level, just like what you see on your screen right now. So it maximizes storage, minimal human effort, but it requires smart layout planning. So now let us go to this fixed position layouts. So it flips everything around. So the project stays put and workers and equipment come to it. Okay, so that is what fixed position layout means. Now, observe these examples. Surgeons operating on a patient, workers building a ship, constructing a house, or building a highway. So you cannot move a patient mid-surgery or drag a half-built ship around the dock, right? So instead of you bringing all materials, tools, and specialists to that one location, it is like hosting a dinner party and the kitchen stays where it is, but you bring all the ingredients and helpers to do it. And helpers to it. So that is an example of a fixed position layout. So now let us proceed with the process-oriented layouts. So it handles wide variety by grouping similar functions together. Okay, take note. Grouping similar functions together. Now, notice this hospital emergency room diagram, okay? So do you see how patient A with a broken leg follows the blue path through triage, radiology, surgery, then to pharmacy. Okay? So while as you notice, this patient B with heart issues takes the red route through different departments. Now, each area, such as the surgery, the radiology, and the pharmacy, is set up for specific tasks, just like having separate kitchen stations for chopping, cooking, and planing. So patients flow between departments based on their unique needs. So let's go to these work cells. So work cells completely revolutionized traditional manufacturing by reorganizing people and machines from scattered departments into focused, self-contained teams. So look at these diagrams, okay? The bottom shows the old way. The bottom diagram shows the old way. So linear assembly lines, as you can see, where workers stand in a row. So each doing one repetitive tasks. So as you have noticed, the top diagram, it shows you a work cell. So workers arranged in a compact U-shaped or circle around the materials and equipment. So here is why this matters. Now in the traditional setup, if one worker is absent or a machine breaks down, the entire line stops. But in work cells, team members are cross-trained on multiple tasks, so they can help each other and adapt quickly. So the U-shaped design means shorter walking distances, better communication, and faster problem solving. Now, these cells are used when you have enough volume to justify dedicating equipment and people to one product family. So, like all variants of iPhone cases or different sizes of the same jeepney part, so the beauty is flexibility. Now, when demand changes or you need to switch to a new product design, you can reconfigure to sell. You can reconfigure the cell quickly without disrupting the entire factory. So it is like having specialized teams that can pivot fast while maintaining quality and efficiency. Okay, so let us try this one wherein we improved A work cell and B work cell. Okay? Now note, in both A and B, that U-shaped work cell can reduce material and employee movement. So the U shape may also reduce space requirements, enhance communication, cut the number of workers, and make inspection easier. Okay? So let us focus here in work cell A. So in work cell A, this is the current layout wherein the workers are in small closed areas. And then we improved this work cell wherein we cross-trained workers that can assist each other and may be able to add a third worker as added output is needed. Okay? So from this current layout, we improve it to this layout. Okay. Now, so these diagram so as you can see, okay, I want to explain in detail, okay? We're still in in work cell A, wherein there is a transformation from these isolated to collaborative work, okay? Now, as you can see again, this left diagram, this one, kindly focus on my pointer for you to follow. It really shows the current problematic layout, right? As I have said earlier. So workers here are trapped in small, closed areas around the material section. Now this creates several issues. Workers cannot see what others are doing. Communication here in this layout is difficult, and if someone needs help or falls behind, others can't easily assist. So it's like having each worker in their own little silo. Okay, now when we improve the layout, this is the right diagram here, it shows that this one is the improved U-shaped work cell where cross-trained workers can assist each other. Notice how the U shape brings everyone closer together, right? So they can make eye contact, they can communicate easily, and physically move to help teammates. So the no so as you can see, this is more, of course, productive, effective, and efficient. Okay? Now let's go to this second work cell. Now from linear, we improve it to cellular efficiency. Now this one shows the traditional straight line layout that is hard to balance. So when you have workers in a rigid line, now if one person's task takes longer than others, it creates bottlenecks to the rest. It's like a domino effect, okay? So you cannot easily redistribute work, and the line moves only as fast as the slowest worker. Okay, so it's like a traffic jam where everyone has to wait for the slowest car. So this is this layout. Now, focus on this right, where it shows the improved U-shaped, the cellular layout, where workers have much better access to the work and of course to each other. So the key breakthrough here is that 4 cross-trained workers were reduced to 3. So that is, as you can see, from this you have 4 workers and then it is reduced to 3. So that's a 25% labor reduction while you are maintaining the same output. So these actually happens because workers can share tasks, help each other during busy periods, and eliminate the wasted time that comes from rigid job assignments. So as you have noticed, this U-shape is revolutionary because it combines the efficiency of specialization with the flexibility of teamwork. Okay, so now let us go to repetitive and product-oriented layouts, which is actually designed for high volume, low variety products where everything flows in a predictable sequence. Now look at McDonald's hamburger assembly line. Okay, look at the diagram, focus on the diagram. So this is pure product-oriented layout in action. So I want you to follow the numbered stations, okay? So let's go first to this station 1. So station 1 starts when an order appears on the video screen. Okay, so they're very high tech, which say that is 11 seconds, okay, to read it. Now station 2 is bond boosting, 20 seconds. Station 3 is assembly with condiment, 14 seconds. Station 4 handles the wrapping, 0 seconds, because it is automated. Now station 5 is immediate pick-up to keep food fresh, 45 seconds. Now finally, we have station 6. It is the customer service for payment. Now, have you noticed how the product, which is your burger, moves step by step through each station, just like cars on a automotive assembly line. So each worker specializes in one task. The timing is precisely calculated, and there is a heated landing pad and storage systems to maintain the quality. Now, the entire process is designed for speed and consistency. This works because McDonald's makes thousands of similar burgers daily, okay? So the layout supports their strategy of fast, standardized service. Now, every element, from the toaster placement to the heated cabinets to the point of sale terminal, is positioned to minimize movement and maximize throughput. So when you have a high volume and standardized products, this linear flow becomes incredibly efficient. So let's proceed here to the product-oriented layouts. So it comes in two types. The first one is the fabrication lines. It builds individual components on a series of machines. So like how San Miguel Corporation makes bottle caps, or how steel mills roll metal sheets. And the second one is the assembly lines. So assembly lines put those fabricated parts together at workstations, like how Mitsubishi assembles jeepneys in their Cainta plant, okay, in Manila. And the key challenge for both is achieving perfect balance. So every workstation must take the same time, or you create expensive bottlenecks. Okay, so there should be a balance for you to have no bottlenecks at all. So a good layout requires careful planning of three critical areas. The first one is the material handling equipment. It is deciding whether you need conveyor belts like in Jollibee kitchens, cranes like in shipping ports, or robot carts like Amazon warehouses. Now, second is the capacity and space requirements. So it is figuring out how much room people and machines need to work safely, considering the noise, the temperature, and breathing room around the equipment. And finally is your environment and aesthetics. So it is making the workplace pleasant with proper windows, plants, and walls that would, of course, improve airflow, reduce noise, and give workers privacy. So two more critical layout considerations. The first one is flows of information. So the layout must help people communicate easily. So this means deciding whether to use open offices for collaboration or private ones for focused work, and positioning teams that work together near each other. Now, the second is the cost of moving between work areas. So some materials are trickier to move than others, okay? Moving hot meal in a steel plant requires special equipment and shorter distances, while moving paperwork is very easy. Now, smart layouts put areas that exchange difficult to move materials right next to each other. Okay, so how do you actually evaluate if a layout is working? Now think of yourself as a detective, okay? First, go walk around the facility. Do not just look at blueprints. You have to get your feet dirty and see what is really happening. Then, work through your checklist systematically, like jotting down specific observations, like workers are constantly bumping into each other here, or this machine sits idle half the day. So be honest about what is working and what is a mess. Your final report should tell the real story of whether this layout is helping or hurting the business. Alright, so now we are getting to the fun part, the math behind process layouts. Okay? So remember that hospital emergency room we talked about earlier? Well, you cannot just randomly place departments and hope for the best. There is actually a systematic way to figure out the optimal arrangement using mathematical models, okay? So we are going to learn how to calculate the best positions for departments to minimize travel time, reduce costs, and maximize efficiency. So it is like solving a puzzle where every piece has to be in exactly the right spot. So here is where it gets strategic. The golden rule for process layouts is simple. Departments that exchange lots of materials or people should be neighbors. Now think of it like planning a mall. You'd put the food court you will place the food court near the cinema because people flow between them constantly. The math considers two key factors: how many trips happen between departments and how expensive those trips are based on distance. Then heavy equipment moves cost more than paperwork. So we calculate the total cost as trips multiplied by distance related expenses. Okay, so now here is the actual formula that makes it all work. So it's actually pretty logical. We are minimizing cost by adding up all the trips between x sub ij. So wait, let's read the formula, okay, together. We are minimizing costs by adding up all the trips. That's why our function here is, sorry, summation. Okay, between x sub ij. So x sub ij is how many loads move from department I to department J. Okay? So it's like 50 trips per day from receiving to assembly. Okay? Now the C sub J, okay, the C sub IJ is the costs per trip based on distance and difficulty. Okay. Now you multiply those together, as you can see, focus on my pointer so that you will not be lost. You will multiply this together for every department pair. And then you add all them up. You add them all up and you have now the total material handling cost. Okay? Now, the goal here is finding the arrangement that gives us the lowest number. Okay? Okay, so let us try this real world problem. Okay? So Walter's company management wants to arrange the 6 departments of its factory in a way that will minimize interdepartmental material handling costs. So they make an initial assumption to simplify the problem. Now, to simplify the problem, okay, their initial assumption is that each department is 20 by 20 feet and that the building is 60 feet long and 40 feet wide. So before we're going to solve the problem, let us be definite, or let's define what is really the problem all about. Now the problem is Walter's company wants to arrange 6 departments in their factory in order to minimize the cost of moving materials between departments. Okay, so that is the problem. So let us proceed to the next step of solving this problem. Okay, the first step is we will construct a from to matrix. So from to matrix, okay? Say from assembly to painting, from assembly to machine, from assembly to receiving departments, okay? So this is an example of a from to matrix. Now, as you can see, we create a table showing how many loads move between each department per week. And then, this will help us visualize the flow of materials or parts in the factory. So let's see on how to read this from to matrix. So let's see, for example, how many loads are you going to transfer from painting department to receiving department? So how do we do that? Okay, so here you have the painting department and then you will transfer the load to receiving department. Now the question is how many loads are you going to transfer? So here it shows 50 loads, okay? So that is how you read the from to matrix. Okay, so now let us proceed to step 2. Now in step 2, we determine space requirements. So we figure out how much space each department needs, okay? And then we have to draw a layout like a top view, okay? Just imagine a top view for easier drawing of layout. Top view of the building, dividing it into areas for each department, okay? So as given in the problem, so you have 40 feet by 60 feet. So as you can see, this is the current layout of the department. You have the assembly line, and then beside the assembly line, the assembly department is the painting department. Then beside the painting department is the machine department, and then just also beside the machine department is your testing, then so on and so forth. Okay, so let's proceed now to step 3. So your step 3 here is that we will develop an initial schematic diagram. So how do you do this? So this is your initial schematic diagram. Now, you have to create a flow chart, okay? This schematic diagram is like a flow chart showing how departments are connected based on material movement. So, based on how many loads they are going to transfer, okay? So, try, as you can see, the next bullet here says, try to place departments with high material flow next to each other, okay? So, now, this schematic diagram is of course based from our from to matrix. Okay, let's try for example. We started first from the assembly department. So here in the assembly department, we moved 50 loads going to painting department. So that's why you have this line, okay? And then it says 50, meaning you move 50 loads from your assembly department to painting department. And the next, from assembly department to the machine department. So you have here from assembly to machine. So that's why you have 100. Okay? So next, the next one, we will finish first this assembly. Okay, we will do it systematically. So the assembly, from assembly, going to testing department, it says 20. So that's why you have this line. Okay? And then let's proceed. Let's try another one. The second department is the painting department. So from painting department, you will transfer 30 loads going to the machine department. So that's why you have a line from painting to machine. And then it says 30 loads. Okay, next is from painting, you will transfer 50 loads to receiving. So from painting, 50 loads to receiving. So that's why you have a line here going to the receiving. Okay? And then just follow for the rest of the departments. And then you will have this schematic diagram. Okay? This is how it works. So step 4 is where we crunch the numbers using our formula. So we take each department pair, like for example, assembly to painting with 50 loads, and then we multiply by the movement cost. So if they are adjacent or close to each other or just beside each other's departments, so we assume like $1 per load. Now if they are non-adjacent, we assume $2 per load. So assembly to painting might cost 50 loads multiplied to $1 equals to $50 if, of course, they are neighbors, or $100 if they're far apart. So we add all these individual costs to get our total layout cost. Then we can compute different arrangement to find the best arrangement that will, of course, give us the optimal option of the optimal costs of the layout. So let us start. We will calculate the cost of these layouts. Okay, this is our original layout. Now, calculating the costs for each department pair using the from to matrix and of course the layout, because the layout will help us identify if the departments is adjacent to each other or beside each other. Okay. Now let's start with letter A. So in letter A, it says assembly 1 to painting. Okay? So assembly 1 to painting. So we have here 50. Okay? And then we will check, are they adjacent to each other? So let's see the layout. Assembly to painting, yes, they are adjacent to each other. That's why the cost of moving the loads is, you are moving 50 loads, you multiply it to $1. So that's why the cost is a total of $50. Okay? And then let's proceed to letter B. In letter B, it says assembly to the machine. Now, let us check in the layout if this assembly and machine are close to each other. So assembly and machine. Okay? So as you can see, they are not close to each other, or they are non-adjacent departments. So that's why the cost here of moving 100 loads is $2. So you just multiply it. So that's why you have here $200. Now let's proceed to letter C. In letter C, we will be moving the loads from assembly 1 to the testing. Okay? So it says we will move the load of 20. Now the next step is for us to identify if this assembly department and testing department are adjacent to each other. So assembly and testing, they are non-adjacent. Okay? That's why we use here $2. Okay? So you just have to multiply the same process. That's why you get $40. Now, we will just continue on computing the cost of the movement of other departments. Okay? That we will continue. Like for example, from painting to shipping. So where is your painting? So here we have here from painting to shipping, it says 10. Then the next one is we will check in the layout if they are adjacent or non-adjacent. So painting to shipping, painting and shipping, yes, they are adjacent. That's why the cost of transferring the load is only $1. That's why you have here $10, okay? So we will just continue with the computation, the same process as what we did earlier. Okay, so when we are done computing the cost of movement in every department, we will sum it up. So after adding it all up, so we have here $570. So this means that this total of $570 represents the cost of moving all loads between departments in the current layout. Okay? But you have to take note that our goal is of course to be able to find the optimal cost. Okay? So how do we do that? Maybe we can try to rearrange again the departments to find the optimal of the minimum costs. Okay? Okay, since our goal is to find the minimum cost or the optimal cost, that is why step number 5 is we will improve the layout. Now, we look for ways to reduce costs by rearranging departments. So in this case, we switch assembly and also painting to bring assembly closer to machine shop. Okay? Because as you can see, we will be transporting higher loads or more loads from assembly to machine. And then we recalculate the cost with this new arrangement or with this new layout. So after implementing the change, okay, so assembly 1, from here, this is actually your schematic diagram before the rearrangement. From assembly 1 that moves to where painting is, so we just switch together. So that's why our new schematic diagram is this one. Okay, so we just follow the same process of computing for the costs of movement of the loads from each department. The same process wherein we multiply the loads to the costs of the movement of that load. So after that, so how do you do that? Again, I will just have a quick review. So let's say for example from assembly to machine shop. Okay? So assembly to machine shop has 100 loads to transfer. So assembly to machine shop. Now as you can see, this is our new layout. Now in the new layout, it shows that they are just adjacent to each other. So that's why the cost here is $1. Okay? So we just have to continue the same process for the computation. And here is the payoff. As you can see, we did same calculation method, but now our total drops to $480. That is a $90 savings, right? Just from swapping two departments. Now remember, we started at $570 with the original layout. And this simple switch wherein we interchange the position of assembly and painting department brought us down to $480. So that represents a 60% cost reduction in material handling expenses. So this is the power of mathematical optimization, finding arrangements that save real money through smarter positioning of departments based on actual material flow data. Okay, so step 6 wraps up with a clear cost-benefit analysis. So as you can see, old cost was $570 and then the new cost is only $480, giving us $90 in weekly savings. So that might not sound huge, but take note. Multiply that by 52 weeks and you're saving $4,680 per year. just from this one layout change. So the key insight is that making assembly and machine shop adjacent eliminated expensive long distance trips for that high volume, which is 100 load flow. So this demonstrates how focusing on your biggest material flows deliver the biggest cost reductions. Okay, so now let us shift gears to work cells and their math. Remember those U-shaped teams we talked about earlier? Well, you cannot just throw people together and hope it works, okay? You cannot do that. Never do that. There is actually a systematic way to figure out exactly how many workers you need and how to balance their workload. We will learn to calculate something called takt time. Okay, basically the rhythm your team needs to match customer demand. So it is like choreographing a dance where everyone's moves have to be perfectly timed. Okay, so once you've got your work cell equipment arranged properly, the next challenge is staffing it right. Now look at this comparison on your screen. Focus on your screen. The straight line layout on the left side is hard to balance because work is not divided evenly among workers. But the improved U-shaped layout on the right shows how cross-trained workers have better access to help each other. So notice the key result. They reduced from 4 workers down to 3 workers only while maintaining the same output. So that is a 25% labor savings from savings just from smart layout and cross-training. Okay, so staffing work cells efficiently requires two key calculations. So the step one is determining takt time. So basically the rhythm your cell needs to maintain. Okay? So now, if customers want 100 units per day and you only have 8 hours available, then your takt time is 4.8 minutes per unit. So step 2 is to calculate how many workers do you need by dividing the total operation time by your takt time. So if making one unit takes 12 minutes total across all tasks, you'd need 2.5 workers, which rounds up to 3 people to meet customer demand. Okay, let us try this real work problem. Stephen Hall's company in Dayton makes auto mirrors. So the major customer is the Honda plant nearby. Honda exports 600 mirrors delivered daily, and the work cell producing the mirrors is scheduled for 8 hours. Now Hall wants to determine the takt time and the number of workers required. Okay, so let us work through this real-world problem step by step. Now, Stephen Hall's company makes auto mirrors for Honda, and Honda expects exactly 600 mirrors delivered every single day. Now, the production schedule follows 8 hours of work time daily. Our goal is calculating takt time, the precise rhythm needed to meet customer demand. Now here is the math. Takt time equals total available time divided by units required. So we have 8 hours, which converts to 480 minutes or 28,800 seconds of production time. So divide that by 600 mirrors needed and you get 48 seconds per mirror. So this 48-second takt time is crucial. It means every 48 seconds, one completed mirror must come off the production line to satisfy the Honda's demand. Now think of it like um, a metronome setting, okay? The pace for the entire operation. Now, if they are slower than 48 seconds per unit, they will fall behind and disappoint their client, the Honda. So if they are faster, they will overproduce and waste resources. So this takt time, that is why this is very crucial, because this takt time becomes the heartbeat of the entire work cell. So every task, every worker movement, every process step must be designed around this 48-second rhythm. So it is not just a target, okay? It is the fundamental constraint that drives all staffing, equipment, and workflow decisions in the cell. Okay, so let us go now to step 3. So step 3 analyzes the work balance chart to understand how tasks are distributed across the mirror making process. So this chart that you see on your screen right now breaks down the 5 operations. So you have here the assembly, which takes 50 seconds, the paint, which takes 45 seconds, test takes 10 seconds, label takes 20 seconds, and pack for shipping takes 15 seconds. So when you add this up, the total operation time is 140 seconds to complete one mirror. Now here is the critical insight. Remember, our takt time was 48 seconds per mirror, right? But the total work content is 140 seconds. So this tells us immediately that one person cannot possibly make a complete mirror in 48 seconds because the work itself takes nearly 3 times longer. Now look at the chart, okay? Assembly and paint are clearly the bottlenecks, each taking around 45 to 50 seconds. So these two operations alone exceed our 48-second takt time. Meanwhile, test, label, and pack are much shorter tasks that could potentially be combined. Now, this imbalance is exactly why we need multiple workers in the cell. So the chart reveals which operations will require dedicated workers versus which ones can be grouped together. So it also shows us where we might need to break down large tasks or find ways to speed up the bottleneck operations to achieve a better balance across the work cell. Okay, so step 4 applies our formula. Workers required equals total operation time divided by the takt time. So 140 seconds divided by 48 seconds equals 2.92 workers. Now step 5 interprets this result. Theoretically, we need 2.92 people. But of course, in reality, you cannot hire 0.92 of a person, right? So in practice, we have to round it up, then we will need 3 workers. So this means the cell will actually produce slightly faster than 48-second takt time, giving them a small buffer to handle any delays or quality issues. So now we are moving to our third mathematical method, the assembly line balancing. So this is where things get really interesting because we are not just arranging departments anymore. We are choreographing the perfect workflow. Now think of the McDonald's example, McDonald's hamburger assembly line we saw earlier. So every station has to be perfectly timed so no worker is sitting idle while another is overwhelmed. So the math helps us figure out exactly how many workstations we need, how to assign tasks to each station, and how to minimize bottlenecks. So it is like solving a puzzle where every piece has to fit just right. Okay, So let us tackle a real Boeing example. Now, they need to develop a precedence diagram for an electrostatic wing component with 65 minutes total assembly time. So look at this precedence data table. The task A takes 10 minutes and has no prerequisites. So it can start immediately. Task B takes 11 minutes but must follow task A. So task C needs 5 minutes and also follows B. So the key insight is understanding these dependencies. You cannot start task E, take note, until task A is completely finished. So this precedence relationship determines how we will arrange our assembly line stations. Okay, so this is now our precedence diagram that is asked by the problem. Okay, now as you can see, how are we going to make a precedence diagram? Of course, we have here the node. This is the one that is in circle, shape circle, and then from the node there are arrows, right? So how are you going to know when to draw an arrow? Okay, so now kindly focus on this table below. Okay, this is the given, right? You have here the first column, you have the tasks. The second column is you have the assembly time in minutes, and the third column is this is your task must follow task listed below. Okay, meaning all of these tasks in the third column must be finished before you can proceed to this main task or the first column. Okay, so let us try. So we started with task A, right? So task A, it's 10 minutes. And then after task A, when you are done with task A, so you check here, after task A, what are the next tasks? So let's go first here. After task A, we have task B. So that's why you have an arrow going to B. And then there's another one. After task A, you have task E. So that's why you have an arrow going to E here. Okay? So these are the next tasks after you finish A. Okay. Now let's check B. For B, as you can see, there are two tasks because there are two B's here. Let's start with the first B. The first B, after for the task B here, the next task is C. So that's why you have an arrow going to C. Now let's go to another B. After task B, there is this task D. So that's why you have D here. Okay, do you follow? Next. Let's proceed. As you can see, you have here C and D. Okay? C and D. So it says after both, meaning it should be both. After C and D is finished, you have task F that will follow. So in your screen, yeah, always focus on my pointer so that you will not be lost. So as you can see, we have here the convergence point. So this convergence point, meaning after the two tasks follows the next tasks, which is F. Okay, so let us see, go back here. After F, what is the next task? After F, you have G. Okay, so that's why you have an arrow here, G. Okay, next, let us check after. Okay, what's the next here? E. So after E, what's the next? You have H. That's why you have H. Now, as you can see, G and H. So after G and H, you have again a convergence point going to I. Because if they're finished, then you have I. Okay? And just don't forget to write the minutes at the top of each node. So, this diagram helps structure an assembly line and workstations, and it makes it easier to visualize the sequence of tasks. So that is the importance of doing this schematic diagram or the network diagram. Okay? So now we move from precedence diagrams to actual line balancing. So the first step is of course calculating the cycle time. So this determines the maximum time allowed at each workstation to meet production targets. So the formula is very simple. You have production time available per day divided by units required per day. So if Boeing has 480 minutes available daily and needs to produce 40 wing components, so then the cycle time is 12 minutes per workstation. So this means every station must complete its assigned tasks within 12 minutes to maintain the production flow. Okay, so step 2 calculates the theoretical minimum workstations needed. So take the total task duration time. So that's all 65 minutes, right, of work required to build one wing component and divide by your cycle time, which is 12 minutes. So you have 65 divided by 12 equals the 5.42 workstations. Now, since you cannot have 0.42 of a workstation, you round it up to 6 stations minimum. So this gives you the absolute lower bound. Meaning you need at least 6 workstations through the actual solution. Might require more due to precedence constraints. Okay, so step 3 is where the real puzzle solving begins. Actually, assigning tasks to workstations while respecting precedence constraints and staying within the 12-minute cycle time, these involve strategic decisions. Okay, like, can we group task A with task B at station 1? Does that violate any precedence rules? Are we staying under 12 minutes? Well, it's like fitting puzzle pieces together where each piece has timing constraints and dependency rules. So we will use heuristics, systematic rules of thumb, okay, to guide these assignments and create an efficient, balanced line. Okay, so now let's put everything together with a complete Boeing example. We have 480 productive minutes per day, so we need to produce 40 wing components daily. And we know all task times and precedences from the earlier diagram. Our job is grouping these 9 tasks, 9 tasks from A through I into workstations that respect the precedence constraints while of course staying within our cycle time limits. So this is where theory meets practice, and we will see if we can actually achieve that theoretical minimum of 6 stations or if real world constraints force us to use more. Okay, so let us recap the complete problem the complete problem setup. So Boeing needs to produce 40 wing components daily with 480 minutes of available work time. So using our formulas, cycle time equals 480 minutes divided by 40 units. So giving us 12 minutes per workstation. Now, the theoretical minimum workstations is equal to 65 total minutes divided by 12-minute cycle time, which is 5.42 rounded up to 6 stations. Now, the challenge is actually assigning our 9 tasks from A through I to these stations while respecting precedence constraints and staying within the 12-minute cycle time limit. Okay, so step 1 establishes the fundamental rhythm that drives everything else in assembly line balancing. So cycle time is the maximum allowable time at each workstation to meet production demand. So it is your constraint that cannot be violated. So the calculation is very straightforward. You have 480 minutes available divided by 40 units needed, which is equal to 12 minutes per unit. But understanding what this means is very crucial. So this 12-minute cycle time becomes the heartbeat of your entire assembly line. So every single workstation must complete its assigned tasks within exactly 12 minutes, okay? So, or if that will not happen, the entire line breaks down. So think of it like a relay race, okay? Where every runner must finish their leg in exactly 12 minutes. So, if station 3 takes 15 minutes while station 1 only takes 8 minutes, you create a bottleneck there. Now, the entire line can only move as fast as the slowest station. So, what will happen? Of course, products will pile up behind station 3, while station 4 sits idle waiting for work. So, this is why cycle time is very critical, okay? It is not a target or a goal. It is a hard constraint. So you cannot assign more than 12 minutes of work to any single station, regardless of task precedence or logical groupings. So every task assignment decision, every workstation design choice, every balancing trade-off must respect this 12-minute limit. So it becomes the governing principle that determines whether your assembly line design will succeed or fail in meeting Boeing's production requirements. So step 2 gives us the theoretical lower bound of our line design. So we add up all task times. So that is 65 minutes, right? 65 minutes total to build one complete wing component. Then divide by our 12-minute cycle time. So this gives us 5.42 workstations, right? As I have said earlier, I just want to repeat it again. So since we cannot have 0.42 of a workstation, that's why we round it up to 6 stations minimum. So this is the absolute best case scenario. We will need at least 6 stations through precedence constraints. We only need 6 stations, okay? Though precedence constraints might force us to use more in the actual situation. Okay, so in step 3, it is where we actually assign tasks to workstations using systematic rules called the heuristics, okay? Boeing uses the most following tasks method. So this means we prioritize tasks that have the most dependent tasks waiting behind them. So the logic is simple, okay? If we delay a task that many others depend on, we immediately create bottlenecks downstream. So of course, our goal is grouping tasks into workstations while never exceeding the 12-minute cycle time limit and always respecting the precedence constraints from our diagram. So step 4 shows our final solution. So we achieved exactly 6 workstations as predicted. Now looking at the diagram, okay, station 1 has just task A taking 10 minutes. Station 2 combines tasks B and F for 11 minutes total. And station 3 gets task E alone at 11 minutes, while station 4 groups tasks C, D, and F, totaling to 12 minutes exactly. And then station 5 has task H at 11 minutes, and station 6 combines both tasks G and I for 10 minutes. Now, have you noticed? Every station stays at or under our 12-minute cycle time limit, while of course respecting all the precedence relationships. Okay, so now once we have our line balanced, we need to evaluate how good our solution really is. So there are 2 key metrics. So the first one is efficiency. So we divide total task times by actual workstation times the longest cycle time. So for Boeing's solution, that's 65 minutes divided by 6 stations times 12 minutes, so giving us 90.3% efficiency. Now, second is our idle time. So idle time, that is the wasted time when workers are not productive. So we calculate actual stations times cycle time minus our total tasks higher minus our total tasks. So higher efficiency and lower idle time mean a better balanced line. So the efficiency formula is total task times divided by actual number of workstation multiplied to the largest assigned cycle time. So we also have the idle time formula. Now the idle time formula is the actual number of workstation multiplied to the largest assigned cycle time minus the sum of all the task times. So these two formulas let us measure how well balanced our assembly line solution really is and identify any wasted capacity in the system. I actually mentioned this earlier, but let's repeat, okay, to make sure that you understand. So Boeing has given us their current assembly line setup. You have 6 workstations, each with a 12-minute cycle time and a total of 65 minutes of actual work content spread across all stations. So they want to know their efficiency. So the efficiency formula, okay, actually I have said this earlier, but I will just repeat. You need to remember that efficiency is always equal to total task time divided by the number of workstations multiplied to the cycle time. So in this case, let's calculate 65 minutes divided by 6 stations multiplied to 12 minutes. So that gives us 65 over 72, which is equal to 90.3%. Now, what does this 90.3% tells us? Now, this number is not just abstract, okay? It means that roughly 10% of the time workers are standing idle. Now, in the real world, that is actually pretty decent because most assembly lines struggles to get above 85% efficiency because of balancing constraints. Now, think about it. You cannot always divide work perfectly evenly. That's the reality. Some tasks cannot be split. Some have precedence requirements and some need specific equipment at certain stations. Now, the seventh station scenario, here is where it gets interesting. The problem notes that adding a 7th station would actually drop efficiency to 77.4%. Well, why would Boeing even consider this? Well, in practice, companies might add stations for reasons beyond pure efficiency. For example, union agreements requiring maximum workloads, safety regulations limiting repetitive motions, quality control needs, or training new employees. So the math shows that 65 divided by 7 multiplied to 12 will give us 77.4%. So that is a 13 percentage point drop, okay? So you are essentially paying for an extra worker and station to do nothing productive, okay? So in real-world application, when you are out in the industry, you will face this trade-off constantly. So management might pressure you to add capacity by adding stations, but your job as operations managers is to show them the numbers. Sometimes the better solution is rebalancing existing stations, investing in faster equipment, or adjusting the product design itself. Remember, efficiency is not everything, but it is a critical metric for understanding how well you're utilizing your resources. Now, a 90.3% efficient line that produces quality products reliably is often better than chasing that last few percent and creating worker stress and quality issues. Okay, so now let us really dig into why the seventh workstation causes problems, okay? Now, this is crucial for understanding assembly line economics. When you add a seventh station, you are spreading the same 65 minutes of actual work across more stations. I want you to think about it mathematically, okay? You still have the same numerator. You have 65 minutes of work. But your denominators grow from 72 to 84. So that is 7 stations multiplied to 12 minutes. Now here's what is actually happening on the factory floor. With 7 stations instead of 6, you are not magically creating more work to do. You are just redistributing the same tasks. So this means more idle hands, meaning each station now has even more downtime on average. Next is higher labor costs. You are paying another full worker's salary. Next is more space required. That seventh station takes up available floor space. And then next is the additional equipment. So another workstations means more tools, fixtures, and maintenance. So the psychology here of standing around is, here's something, that the textbook doesn't always tells you. Workers hate standing around with nothing to do. It is demoralizing. Yeah, that's true. When people see their coworkers busy while they are idle, it affects their morale. High-performing employees get frustrated when they cannot work at full capacity. So despite the efficiency hit, there are legitimate reasons Boeing might add that seventh station. So the first one is because of ergonomic requirements, breaking down repetitive tasks to prevent injuries. The next one is because of union contracts, agreements limiting work intensity per person. Another reason is quality checkpoints, adding inspection stations between operations. And next is the training flexibility, having a station for new employees to practice. And the last one is the surge capacity, being ready for demand spikes even if current demand does not justify it. So what is the bottom line? Now the bottom line is the drop from 90.3% to 77.4% represents real money, meaning wasted wages, underutilized equipment, and efficient use of factory space. Now, as operations managers, your job is to help leadership understand these trade-offs. Now, sometimes our factors outweigh pure efficiency, but you need to quantify what the decision costs. Okay? So now remember, adding capacity is not always about adding stations. It is often about optimizing what you already have. Alright everyone, let us flip our efficiency calculation around and look at idle time. Okay? Focus on your screen. This is where you really see the waste in the system. So we have our idle time formula here. It is basically asking how much time are we paying for that we are not actually using. So let us work through these together. We have 6 stations, right? And then each with 12 minutes cycle time. So that gives us 72 minutes of total available time. So that is if everyone worked the full 12 minutes at every station. But we know from the problem that we only have 65 minutes of actual work to do. So 72 minus 65 equals 7 minutes of idle time per cycle. So now 7 minutes doesn't sound terrible, okay? Right? But let me show you what this really means if Boeing runs this line for one 8-hour shift, that is 40 cycles. Now you multiply that 7 minutes by 40 cycles, we are talking 280 minutes of workers standing around per shift. So that is over 4.5 hours. Now think about it annually. If they run 250 days a year, single shift, we're looking at about 1,167 hours of idle time. Now, that is basically paying someone for full salary for 29 weeks to stand here. So at Boeing's labor rates, including benefits, you are probably looking at $50,000 to $60,000 literally going nowhere. So here is the thing though, and this is very important, that 7 minutes is not spread evenly. So you might have one station working the full 12 minutes while another station finishes 9 minutes and waits 3 minutes. Okay? Even cycle. So that worker at the 9-minute station, they are standing idle 25 minutes. 25% of their shift. So that is soul crushing for a motivated employee. Now, you might ask, why don't we just move some work from the 12-minute station to the 9-minute station? Okay, why? Because sometimes we cannot because the task cannot be split. So you cannot do half a quality inspection at one station and half at another. So sometimes it's precedence. You need part A attached before you can attach part B. So sometimes it is equipment. The welding robot is bolted to station 3 period. This is the reality of line balancing. So your job as operations manager is to get that idle time as low as possible while accepting the zero idle time is as fantasy. Okay? So the question becomes, is it worth it spending $100,000 to reconfigure the line to save that $50,000? Ideal annual idle cost. Maybe, maybe not. Well, depends on how long you will run this product. So what is your key takeaway? So the key takeaway, idle time equals money evaporation. So 7 minutes per cycle might seem trivial, but multiply it across shifts, days, years, and multiple production lines. Suddenly, you are talking about millions in waste. So that is why companies obsess over the line balancing. Every minute counts. Okay, so why should we compute idle time? So let me break down these 4 key reasons why idle time matters in your future roles. Number 1 is efficiency measure. So idle time reveals the truth about your line performance. Now, when you calculate 90% efficiency, that sounds acceptable. But when you see 7 minutes of workers standing idle every cycle, you understand exactly where the missing 10% went. So this transforms an abstract percentage into visible waste you can actually address. The second one is the cost implications. So this is direct money loss. So those 7 idle minutes at Boeing's $75 per hour, this is direct money, $75. I'm lost. Okay, again. So the second one is cost implications, right? So this is direct money loss. So those 7 idle minutes of Boeing's $75 per hour labor rate is equal to $8.75, which is wasted every single cycle. So run 40 cycles per shift, 3 shifts, 250 days. You are burning $262,500 annually on one line alone. So when you multiply this across multiple lines, idle time becomes a multi-million-dollar problem. Your ability to identify and reduce this will directly impact the bottom line. Now, the second one is the improve opportunities. So idle time is your diagnostic tool. Now, when station 4 sits idle for 3 minutes, while station 1 runs the full 12, you have identified both your bottleneck and your solution. So you can potentially shift a task from the overloaded station to the underutilized one. Okay? So this knowledge tells you exactly where to focus improvement effects without guessing. Now, the last one is the capacity planning. So capacity planning, here is what many actually miss. Idle time is prepared capacity. So those 7 minutes represent almost 10% additional capacity you could activate without buying equipment or hiring workers. Now, if demand increases, you might absorb it through better balancing rather than capital investment. Now, the idle time is not just waste, it is your buffer for growth. Now, the bottom line, computing idle time takes seconds, but understanding its implications separates competent managers from exceptional ones. So it qualifies waste, identifies opportunities, and reveals hidden capacity all in one calculation. Okay, so now we are end with our discussion for layout strategies. See you on our next class.